Welcome back to BeFM Drama, where we turn great works of English literature into gripping radio. Tonight we're bringing you the second and final part in our adaptation of The Trial for Murder, a classic Victorian ghost story from the great master Charles Dickens, our second this week. In this tale, a nameless narrator has been subjected to visions connected with a sensational murder that has occurred in London, in the course of his daily life seeing specters of both the murdered man and his murderer, though he did not know them when he first saw them. Now, quite unexpectedly, the narrator has been selected for the jury trial of the accused murderer. The moment the accused saw the narrator, he was shocked with horror and begged his attorney to have the man dismissed as a juror. What could all this mean, and where might it lead? Let's find out. As the accused man could give no reason for why he wished to see me challenged, and admitted that he had not even known my name until he had heard it called and I appeared, his pleas were ignored. I was chosen as foreman of the jury. On the second morning of the trial, after evidence had been taken for 2 hours, I looked over my fellow jurymen and found an inexplicable difficulty in counting them. I counted them several times, yet always with the same problem. There was always one too many of them. I touched the juryman next to me and whispered to him, "Oblige me by counting us." He looked surprised by the request, but turned his head and counted.
"Why? We are But no, it's not possible. No, we are 12.
According to my counting that day, we were always right in detail, but in total we were always one too many. There was no appearance, no figure to account for it, but I had now an inward foreshadowing that the figure would surely come. The jury was housed at a London tavern. We slept in one large room and were always under the eye of a police officer. His name was Mr. Harker. On the night of the second day, I went in and sat beside him and offered him a pinch of snuff. As Mr. Harker's hand touched mine in taking it from my box, a peculiar shiver crossed him, and he said,
"Who is this?"
Following Mr. Harker's eyes and looking along the room, I saw again the figure I had expected, the second of the two men who had gone down Piccadilly. I rose, advanced a few steps, then looked round at Mr. Harker. He was quite unconcerned, laughed, and said in a pleasant way,
"I thought for a moment we had a 13th juryman without a bed, but I see it is the moonlight."
Making no revelation to Mr. Harker, but inviting him to take a walk with me to the end of the room, I watched what the figure did. It stood for a few moments by the bedside of each of my 11 brother jurymen, close to the pillow. It seemed to look down pensively at each sleeping figure. It took no notice of me or of my bed, and seemed to go out where the moonlight came in, through a high window. Next morning at breakfast, it appeared that everybody present had dreamed of the murdered man the night before, except myself and Mr. Harker. I now felt convinced that the second man I had seen going down Piccadilly was the murdered man himself. On the 5th day, when the case for prosecution was drawing to a close, a miniature portrait of the murdered man, found in a hiding place where the murderer had been seen digging, was shown in evidence. It was handed up the bench to be inspected by the jury. As an officer in a black gown was making his way with it across to me, the figure of the second man who had gone down Piccadilly emerged from the crowd, took the miniature from the officer, and gave it to me with his own hands, at the same time speaking in a low and hollow tone. I was younger then, and my face was not then drained of blood. The figure went on down the line, passing the portrait from one juror to the next, and finally back into my possession. Not one of the others, however, noticed him. Later on that 5th day, the case for the prosecution being closed, our discussion was more animated and serious. Towards midnight, when some of us were preparing for bed, I again saw the murdered man. He stood grimly, beckoning to me. On my going towards him, he immediately disappeared. This was the beginning of a new series of appearances, all in the single long room where we stayed together. Whenever a group of my brother jurymen spoke, I saw the head of the murdered man among theirs. It must be noted that until the appearance of the miniature portrait on the 5th day, I had never seen the dead man in court. 3 changes occurred now that we started on the case for the defense. 2 of them I will mention together. First, the figure was now in court continually, and it never spoke to me there, but always to whoever was speaking at the time. For instance, the throat of the murdered man had been cut straight across. In the opening statement for the defense, it was suggested that the dead man might have cut his own throat. At that very moment, the figure, with its throat in that dreadful sliced open condition described, stood at the speaker's elbow, motioning across and across its windpipe, now with the right hand, now with the left, vigorously demonstrating the impossibility that such a wound could be self-inflicted. In another instance, as a woman testified to the good character of the accused man, the figure stood beside her, looking her full in the face and shaking its head in disgust. The third change was the most striking. Although the appearance itself was not perceived by those whom it addressed, its coming close to people invariably led to some visible disturbance on their part. It seemed to me as if it were prevented from fully revealing itself to others, but that it could invisibly overshadow their minds. When the leading counsel for the defense suggested the hypothesis of suicide, and the figure stood at the learned gentleman's elbow, frightfully sawing at its own severed throat, it is undeniable that the counsel lost his train of thought, wiped his forehead with his handkerchief, and turned extremely pale. On the 8th day, I thought that the figure was not there, until I saw it bending forward, leaning over a woman. Immediately afterwards, that woman screamed, fainted, and was carried out. When the case was over, and the judge settled himself down with his papers to sum up the verdict, the murdered man, entering by the judge's door, approached his lordship's desk and looked eagerly over his shoulder at the pages of his notes. A change came over the judge's face. His hands stopped. The peculiar shiver that I knew so well passed over him. He faltered, apologized to his audience, and did not recover until he had drunk a glass of water. Through all the monotony of those interminable days, the murdered man never lost one trace of his distinctiveness in my eyes, nor was he at any moment less distinct than anybody else in the room. I must not omit, as a matter of fact, that I never once saw the appearance of the murdered man look at his murderer. Again and again I wondered, why does he not? But he never did. Nor did he look at me, until the last closing minutes of the trial arrived. The jury retired to consider the murderer's fate. Twice we returned to court to beg to have certain facts from the judge's notes reread to us. None of us had the smallest doubt about the murderer's guilt. Finally, our decision made, we returned into the courtroom. The murdered man at that time stood directly opposite the jury box, on the other side of the court. As I took my place, his eyes rested on me with great attention. He seemed satisfied, and slowly shook a great gray veil, which he carried on his arms for the first time, over his head and whole form. As I gave our verdict, guilty, the veil collapsed, all was gone, and his place was empty. The murderer, being asked by the judge whether he had anything to say before the sentence of death should be passed down upon him, indistinctly muttered something which was described in the leading newspapers of the following day as a few rambling, incoherent, and half-audible words in which he was understood to complain that he had not had a fair trial because the foreman of the jury was prepossessed against him. The remarkable declaration that he really made was this:
My lord, I knew I was a doomed man when the foreman of my jury came into the box. My lord, I knew he would never let me off, because before I was taken, he somehow got to my bedside in the night, woke me, and put a rope around my neck.
And so, with the aid of a ghostly witness and his mortal agent, our narrator who inexplicably sees what others do not, justice is rendered and the murderer sentenced to die. The verdict seems to have freed the specter from its bondage, releasing it to whatever strange things might lie beyond that final veil of death. From BeFM Drama, this is your host, Joshua Cornwell, bringing to a close this special double feature of classic ghost stories from Charles Dickens. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our Sunday compilation broadcast, where you can listen to both of these classic stories as a single, uninterrupted episode. From our studio in Busan, this is your host, Joshua Cornwell, wishing you good night.